Well, I'm going to be talking about some recent developments respecting the third secret of Fatima, but John Siles is going to give you the full course. He's going to take the mystery of the third secret in more detail from its inception until around the year 2000. I'm going to pick it up with certain interesting developments. When I got involved in this whole controversy, I remember the day very clearly. I was with Father Gruner, and we got the facts from Rome containing the text of the third secret at Fatima, released at long last. And we read it, and our reaction was, huh? That's it? This is what they kept under lock and key for 40 years? This rather enigmatic vision that discusses some kind of apocalyptic scenario, but no explanation of how, why, when, who, from the Virgin? Even Mother Angelica said, I happen to be one of those people who thinks we didn't get the whole thing. But my problem at the time was, do I really want to go down this road? Another conspiracy? I resisted mightily the conclusion that something was missing. But the problem is, I have this legal training. And the legal training makes me naturally suspicious of claims. I test them. And then you start to look at evidence. And the evidence is like a jigsaw puzzle. If you have a couple of pieces in the middle of the frame of the puzzle, you really can't tell what it's all about. If you have a few more pieces, maybe it's a little clearer. Finally, you get a certain number of pieces together, and you know exactly what the picture is. Even if not every piece is there, you see enough to know what the picture is. And as I saw one piece after another of evidence fitting into this jigsaw of the mystery of the third secret of Fatima, I no longer resisted the conclusion that something was missing. And as many of you probably already know, Antonio Socci went through the same process. He thought we were all nuts. He thought we were the Fatimites, those fanatics who look for meanings behind seemingly innocent events. The Italian word for that is dietrologia, looking behind something, dietro, the Italian word dietro. We're the people who look behind. We're look-behindists, who don't take events at face value. Well, he started to study the question. He started to read a lot of the material that, thank God for Father Gruner, had been circulated around the world, and he was persuaded of exactly the opposite conclusion. And he wrote his book, The Fourth Secret of Fatima, an ironic title, meaning there was more to the third secret, a second part, the Virgin's explanation of this vision, the soundtrack of the movie. And so, having become convinced, I began my hunt, my lawyer's scavenger's hunt for evidence. And every single piece of evidence I came across fit into this puzzle. John's going to go over a lot of it for you. Some of it may be familiar to you, but consider this to be something like a college course 101, Third Secret 101. Get out your notebooks and take notes when John speaks, and I'll probably have something you'll want to make notes on too. A couple of little bits and pieces. I'm going to talk about basically 7 points. The first of these is internal evidence in the vision itself. The phrase in quotations by Sister Lucia, when she sees this bishop, as if in a mirror, she says, in quotes, "We had the impression it was the Holy Father." Now that's curious, because why would there be only an impression that the bishop in white that they were seeing in this vision was the Holy Father? The word impression indicates a state of uncertainty, obviously, and that state of uncertainty must have arisen because of peculiar facts. It should have been obvious to her that it was the Pope if it was the Pope, and yet they only had the impression. Later on in the vision, we see that the Holy Father is killed, but it's not clear if the Holy Father who is killed is the bishop in white as to whom she had the impression it was the Holy Father. Now, I'm not sure what these quotation marks mean around the phrase, "we had the impression it was the Holy Father." My original impression was that it was a quotation from an external document, another document that would explain the vision. Why else would she put quotation marks around it? But it also could be the case that she uses these single quotation marks as a parenthesis to indicate parenthetically what she was thinking at the time she received the vision. I don't know the answer to that. So it could be either quotation marks, in which case she's quoting another document, in which the statement, we had the impression it is the Holy Father, or was the Holy Father appears, or she's observing that parenthetically. In any case, Our Lady must have clarified at some point this impression. But if she clarified it, she would have had to say things that pertain to the third secret of Fatima. She certainly wouldn't leave Lucia with the impression that it was the Holy Father, because later on in the same vision, she says the Holy Father is executed by a band of soldiers. This is curious. An impression is followed by a certainty. Why? What accounts for the transition from her impression in the first part of the vision to her certainty at the end that it's the Holy Father? There must have been an intervening explanation by the Virgin that it's the Holy Father. Now, very tellingly, the word that she uses when she says what was translated in English as impression is presentimento. Presentimento doesn't quite mean impression in English. It's more accurately translated as a premonition, a foreboding, an uneasy feeling, but still not a certainty. And again, that uncertainty must have been clarified somewhere along the line during the apparitions. Otherwise, we would have a situation in which Our Lady left them with a vague impression, and we don't really know who the bishop in white is, but obviously we do know. So that's an interesting little tidbit of evidence that fits into the larger puzzle. And as I say, John's going to give you a lot of the big pieces of the puzzle in his talk. We're doing it in reverse order because I have to leave early. Now, is this reference a reference to two different people? Are we talking about a bishop in white who only appears to be the Pope, as to whom you have the impression it's the Holy Father, and then another bishop in white who is the Holy Father, and this one is killed? Now, bishops in India, the Philippines, and other tropical countries wear white cassocks, but no one would have the impression that any of these third world bishops are the Holy Father. But we see in the vision a white-clad bishop fleeing Rome over dead bodies, which happens to coincide with a vision of St. Pius X, that one of his successors in the future, who had the same name, which would be Joseph, or Giuseppe Sarto was his name before he became Pope, fleeing the Vatican under such circumstances and then dying a horrible death in seclusion later on. Is Pope Benedict, whose name before he became Pope, Joseph Ratzinger, the bishop in white who was killed? I don't know. And the reason we don't know is we don't have Our Lady's explanation, which is another reason why we know that something is missing from the text of the vision alone. It raises one question after another, as to which we have no definitive answer without the Virgin's explanation. So the question arises, does the vision, published in 2000, take place during a time in which there is more than one white-clad bishop living in the Vatican? That is, does it take place in our time? The only time in church history when a pope has not only resigned under suspicious circumstances, and they are suspicious as far as I'm concerned, but has also made it clear that he still considers himself to have resigned only the exercise of his office, the active exercise of the Petrine ministry, as he put it, while retaining the Pope's white cassock, the papal coat of arms, and the very name he had as Pope. This has never happened in church history. We have never seen two bishops dressed in white residing in the Vatican. So that's a small but telling piece of evidence that something is missing respecting this vision, meaning the explanation of the Virgin. The next point I want to talk about, the link to the message of Akita. We know, of course, from having heard of it before and read of it in many places, that the vision predicts that if men do not amend their ways, fire will rain down from heaven and destroy a great part of humanity, the good along with the bad, such that the living will envy the dead. What do we see in the vision? An angel with a flaming sword and a devastated city. So the flames have obviously devastated some portion of the earth. Then we see the Virgin repelling these devastating rays or flames from the sword, but not before they've done terrible damage. because Akita doesn't say the whole world will be destroyed, but rather the great part of humanity, with fire raining down from the heavens. Now, the apparitions have been authenticated by Bishop Ito. His letter of approbation is accessible online. There's controversy over certain interpretations of the letter, certain versions of the letter, but they all have one thing in common. He has given his approbation to the apparitions as authentic and worthy of belief, and he recites in his letter the approval of the apparitions expressed to him by Cardinal Ratzinger, although not officially. And the letter states he's awaiting official word from the Vatican, which never came, yet the traditional test of the veracity of a Marian apparition is the approval of the local ordinary. And the part that I'm going to focus on in reference to the third secret is the following from the apparition of October 13, 1973. The work of the devil will infiltrate even into the church. One will see cardinals opposing other cardinals and bishops confronting other bishops. The priests who venerate me will be scorned and condemned by their confreres. Churches and altars will be sacked. The church will be full of those who accept compromises. And the demon will tempt many priests and religious to leave the service of the Lord. This is a description of the scenario taking place before our very eyes at the ridiculously misnamed Synod on the Family. Now, Bishop Ito, as many of you know, told Howard D. that he was certain, and I'm quoting, Akita was an extension of Fatima, and Cardinal Ratzinger personally confirmed to me that the two messages, Fatima and Akita, are essentially the same. Now, what do we see then in Akita? We see a double chastisement. There's a crisis in the church. There's a loss of faith in the church. There are cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops opposing bishops, and the world is devastated. A two-pronged punishment of the church and the world as a whole. What do we see in the vision? Well, we see a punishment of the world. We don't see the related aspect of the crisis in the church that led up to this punishment. We do know from Sister Lucia's entry in the fourth memoir that there is an aspect involving a crisis in the church, because she writes, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc. And we know that there's a reference here to a crisis of dogma outside the country of Portugal, meaning a crisis of faith in the Catholic Church. And the Vatican has spent the last 15 years running away from the etc. They used the third memoir in the official explanation of the vision instead of the fourth memoir, where the etc. appears. Cardinal Bertone was asked about it. He said, it's difficult to say whether the etc. relates to the second part of the secret or the third secret, as if he didn't know. All he had to do was ask Sister Lucia, what did he mean? It's difficult to say. It wasn't difficult for him to say. It was as easy as asking Sister Lucia to which part it referred. And he said, in my opinion, it relates to the second part, about world wars, persecutions of the church, and so forth, in his opinion, when he had access to the only source that would take the matter out of the realm of opinion and make it a certainty, and yet, curiously, he either never consulted the source, or he did consult the source and doesn't want us to know what he found out. So I think that in the vision, and we have to speculate because they've deprived us of Our Lady's commentary, we see a continuation of the persecution of the church, and indeed the final persecution, resulting in the death of a pope at the hands of a band of executioners. Which brings me to the third point, the revelations of 2010. Now, here's the Pope going to Fatima on a pilgrimage. He had the right to choose any questions he wished the reporters to ask him during his in-flight press conferences. And unlike the press conferences of the current occupant of the See of Peter, Benedict thinks carefully about what he's going to say before he says it, plans his answers in advance, and selects the questions in advance. And the question he selected was asked by Father Lombardi. This is 10 years after we're told the third secret is over and done with. Everything in the secret pertains to 20th century events, and the Pope being executed in outside a ruined city is John Paul II not being executed in an intact city. That's what we were told. 10 years later, Benedict says it's nonsense, implicitly. Lombardi asks, Holiness, what significance do the apparitions of Fatima have for us today? And when you presented the text of the third secret in the Vatican press office in June 2000, it was asked of you whether the message could be extended beyond the attack on John Paul II, which, by the way, it has nothing to do with, and also to the other sufferings of the Pope. Is it possible, according to you, to frame also in that vision the sufferings of the Church of today for the sins of the sexual abuse of minors? So he's asked to explain whether the third secret relates to the so-called pedophile crisis in the priesthood, which is actually a crisis of homosexual predators in the priesthood. But he goes beyond that in his answer. He says, beyond this great vision of the suffering of the Pope, which we can in substance refer to John Paul II, are indicated future realities of the Church, which are little by little developing and revealing themselves. Thus it is true that beyond the moment indicated in the vision, it is said, it is seen, the necessity of a passion of the Church that naturally is reflected in the person of the Pope, but the Pope is in the Church, and therefore the sufferings of the Church are announced. Notice what he's doing here. He's going beyond the pedophile crisis. He's saying there's going to be a passion of the Church. He's not saying the vision relates to John Paul II escaping death. He's saying the vision relates to John Paul II in the sense that the Pope is part of the Church, and the Church will have to undergo a passion. He is not adopting the view that this is all relative to the failed assassination attempt. And he also says that the secret involves something beyond the moment indicated in the vision. How would he know that? How would he know there's anything in the third secret beyond the moment indicated in the vision, unless he knows of something beyond the moment indicated in the vision? Something that his advisors have told him is not authentic, it would be too scandalous, it would terrify the faithful, we really don't know if it's reliable. Let's just publish the vision and give it our own interpretation. And so there's a kind of mental reservation going on here that this is just the annotations of Sister Lucia, and we needn't reveal it to the public. But he goes on to say, in the same answer, as for the novelty that we can discover today in this message, it is that attacks on the Pope and the Church do not come only from outside, but the sufferings of the Church come precisely from within the Church, from sins that exist in the Church. This has always been known, but today we see it in a really terrifying way, that the greatest persecution of the Church does not come from enemies outside, but arises from sin in the Church. The greatest persecution of the Church is internal. 3 years later, he resigned. The greatest persecution is internal. Now, look at the vision. Do you see in that vision the slightest indication of an internal persecution of the Church that is greater in terms of danger than the external persecution, which is the only thing we see in that vision? No, we don't see anything of the kind. And yet, as I said, this clearly involves a double chastisement. So the part of the vision that we see relates to the outcome of this double chastisement. The part we haven't seen is Our Lady's explanation of how the Church, through its own failures, through the failures of the upper hierarchy, ends up in this apocalyptic scenario where the Pope himself, for the first time in Church history, is assassinated by external enemies of the Church. Now, another interesting piece of evidence, the link of the third secret to Islam. We know that the village of Fatima is named after the Princess Orem, who converted to Catholicism when she was captured during the reconquest of Portugal, liberating it from Muslim domination. The prince asked for her hand in marriage if she would convert. She consented, and her name, before she converted and consented, Fatima, is now the name of the village where the apparitions occurred. So this village is kind of an icon of the reconquest of the world for the faith, and in particular, the reconquest of the world respecting Islam. Now, in the vision, we see a very curious phrase that has always troubled me. He was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him. Why the arrows, I thought? Is there something wrong with Lucia? Is this vision maybe, after all, a bit of hokum? Arrows? What does that have to do with anything? Why arrows? Why would Our Lady confide such a peculiar detail? In the age of atomic weaponry, we see a pope being killed by a combination of weapons, bullets and arrows. I pondered this for years until I stumbled across something on the internet. The sources, however, are reliable. And that source, a major news source, talks about the ISIS magazine in Dabiq, quoting a fanatical imam who prophesies as follows. This is kind of the anti-message of Fatima. We will conquer your Rome, break your crosses, and enslave your women by the permission of Allah, the Exalted. Okay. That's what they always say. But then I read another article. It's appeared in the Italian daily Il Giornale. And it may provide one of those little historical details that clarify a prophecy as time goes by and we see more and more of the pieces of the prophecy fall into place. And the article talks about an e-book being distributed to Muslim militants that provides instructions to prepare for the conquest of Rome by learning to use various weapons, including homemade bows and arrows. The idea is to stockpile these weapons, which are not easily detected and are not currently illegal, so they can be employed in urban guerrilla warfare. And the instruction manual for the conquest of the West, including Rome, states, the advent of the war for the conquest of Rome will consist primarily of the urban guerrilla in the cities and streets of Europe. Make of it what you will. I think it's another piece in the puzzle. Suddenly, the reference to a pope in the future being slain by bullets and arrows falls into place as the completed jigsaw puzzle nears completion. We're still lacking some key pieces, but it's getting closer. Without the Virgin's explanation of the vision, this is only a well-founded speculation. Don't have to accept what I'm saying, but it seems reasonable. Why else would there be a reference to arrows? And I think it was Albert Einstein who said that if there's a third world war, the next world war will be fought with bows and arrows. So I think there's something there. Another item I'd like to bring to your attention is the link to the Synod on the Family. In 2008, Cardinal Carlo Caffarra, the Archbishop of Bologna, gave an interview. He revealed that the last surviving visionary, Sister Lucia, had responded to his request for information with a letter. In the letter, she warned that the final battle, and I'm quoting, the final battle, the apostolate has a book called The Devil's Final Battle, the final battle between the Lord and the reign of Satan will be about marriage and the family. Don't be afraid, because anyone who works for the sanctity of marriage and family will always be fought and opposed in every way, because this is the decisive issue. Obviously, that final battle is underway. It's no coincidence that Cardinal Caffarra is one of the 5 contributors to Remaining in the Truth of Christ, the so-called 5 Cardinals book, in which he and 4 other cardinals, defend the traditional teaching on marriage and the reception of Holy Communion by the divorced and so-called remarried, which is, of course, impossible. Because, as Cardinal Caffarra points out in this book, the married person is ontologically, in his being, consecrated to Christ, conformed to him. And even if the 2 parties separate, the spouse remains integrated into such a mystery, even if the spouse attacks the sacramental bond by entering into a state of life that contradicts it. There's an ontological link between marriage and Christ himself that cannot be broken, and therefore it is impossible to allow someone to receive the body of Christ living in a state that contradicts that ontological link which is forged in holy matrimony. Incredibly enough, this is now a matter for debate at the Synod on the Family, where we see, just as Our Lady of Akita predicted, cardinals opposing cardinals and bishops opposing bishops. How much more evidence do we need that we are looking at the unfolding of a prophecy that pertains to the third secret of Fatima? The next issue, the new biography of Sister Lucia, which came out in 2013, I believe. In there, we see this revelation. Our Lady told her, according to this biography produced by the Sisters of the Convent at Carmel, "Be at peace and write what they have commanded you, but not, however, that which has been given to you to understand of its meaning," meaning the vision, the meaning of the vision. So Our Lady had confided to Sister Lucia something about the meaning of this vision, which she was not to write down at that time. Now, obviously, it's ridiculous to conclude from this that Our Lady said, "Never reveal what I have told you about the meaning of the vision." Why? So that we could have Cardinal Sodano explain it for us? I don't think so. Never reveal what I have told you about the meaning of this vision because the Vatican Secretary of State must explain it 70 years from now. I hardly think so. What obviously happened, and this is what Antonio Socci concludes, is that this separate part of the revelation was written down on a different date, and we know, of course, that there were 2 envelopes sent to the Vatican on 2 different dates pertaining to the secret, and John will get into that. But further on in this biography, after we see this revelation about not writing down what has been given to you, Lucia, by me, Our Lady, to understand concerning its meaning, Sister Lucia writes, "I felt my spirit inundated by a mystery of light that is God, and then I saw him and heard the point of a lance like a flame that is detached, touches the axis of the earth, and it trembles. Mountains, cities, towns, and villages where their inhabitants are buried. The sea, the rivers, the clouds exceed their boundaries, inundating and dragging with them in a vortex houses and people in a number that cannot be counted. It is the purification of the world from the sin in which it is immersed. Hatred, ambition provoke the destructive war. And I felt my racing heart. In my spirit, a soft voice said, in time, one faith, one baptism, one church, holy, Catholic, apostolic. In eternity, heaven." She's talking about a chastisement of the world followed by the triumph of the Immaculate Heart in time. One faith, one baptism, one church, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. But again, we're forced to put together pieces of evidence and draw reasonable conclusions because we don't have what Our Lady actually said to Sister Lucia, even though it's well nigh impossible to deny that there is such an explanation. And Socci so concludes. And he refers in his article on this development to the mysterious attachment to the vision that Archbishop Capovilla admitted on tape, and this was published in the Italian press, existed, that there was an attachment to the vision. We don't have that attachment. Now, the World Apostolate of Fatima did an English translation of this book. And wouldn't you know that this translation of the key phrase has been, shall we say, tampered with. "Be at peace and write what they order you," says their version, "but do not give your opinion of its meaning." That's not what the original text in Portuguese says. The original Portuguese text says, "Do not write what has been given to you, that which has been given to you to understand concerning its meaning." Something given to Lucia, not her opinion. Well, I pointed this out in one of my columns at fatima.org, and the World Apostolate of Fatima responded to me. A respectful reply to Christopher Ferrara is what they called it. That in itself was very suspicious. They don't have any respect for me. So, being a suspicious attorney type of guy, I said, anyone who tells me he respects me when I know he doesn't respect me must be worried. He must be trying to avoid giving me any offense by telling me how respectful he is. I'm not demanding that he respect me. It's his right not to respect me. He doesn't have to give a hoot about anything I write or say. But here he is all of a sudden respecting me. when he never did before. So my antenna were raised, and here's what he wrote in his explanation. We use the word opinion rather than understanding. We use the word opinion rather than understanding. Well, gee, those are two different words, aren't they? The point is, Sister Lucia understood that the church was to interpret the meaning of the secret, not her. And she was not to write down any further revelations she may have received. We cannot hide something that Our Lady did not want her to reveal. Notice he's saying two things at once here. This is double talk. He's saying, first of all, that Sister Lucia understood that the church was to interpret the meaning of the secret. That's not what Our Lady ever said. She never said the church is to interpret it. She came to earth to tell us what the secret means, not to give us something that we need a special decoder ring to understand 70 years later. So no, it's not a question of interpretation. Nothing in the message of Fatima is subject to interpretation except for this obscure vision. Everything else is perfectly clear. Even the name of the Pope who will reign at the time of the commencement of World War II. So that's one thing he's trying to say. Then he also says in the same paragraph, we cannot hide something that Our Lady did not want her to reveal. So now there is something that Our Lady did not want her to reveal. So his position is that Our Lady said, I've got a secret, but that's for me to know and you to find out. Essentially, I came here for nothing. I came here to confuse you all and leave the interpretation up to Cardinal Sodano, a very reliable guy, by the way, when he's not covering up the scandal of Father Marcial and the Legionaries of Christ for decades on end because they're lining his pockets and the Vatican's pockets with bushels of cash. So that's a non-denial. He admits that the World Apostolate of Fatima replaced the word understanding with opinion, but he tries to have it both ways. Lucia was told not to write down her understanding, which isn't the issue, but she was also told not to write down the Virgin's understanding. It's double talk. But then the plot thickens. Someone came to the defense of the World Apostolate of Fatima, a fellow by the name of Kevin Simons. And he contacted the World Apostolate of Fatima, and he spoke to Mr. Carollo. And he got a very different version from Mr. Carollo. Mr. Carollo told him, this is what he reports in his own article on the web, I'm not revealing any confidences, he published this. The answer that I received, says Simons about Carollo, was that it was now very late in the editorial process. It was too late to make any changes. According to a notice by the Carmelite sisters, the publishing date was slated for March 22nd, but this ended up being delayed until April 13th. So they had more time to fix it, and they didn't. Those familiar with the publishing world know that a printing company needs a final copy in order to print. Once the final seal of approval is given, any further changes incur a fee. Really? That's the excuse? I happen to be a published author, and I can tell you I've paid such fees to make changes before things go out, when you don't catch them until the last minute. But then he goes on to say, based on the above, WAF USA was going to go with the translation as is. Oh, sure, why not? We've misrepresented what Our Lady said. It's a fundamental blunder. She didn't say that at all, but we're going to go with it. We'll just go with it because we're the World Apostolate of Fatima. And we're very devoted to Our Lady. We want the truth to be known about Fatima, unless it costs a fee to correct the final copy. Now, we're told by Mr. Simons that there's a second edition in the works, okay? And in the second edition, supposedly they're going to correct it, this mistake. I have yet to see the second edition or in what way they're going to correct it. But isn't this curious that when I bring up the issue, he stands by the translation, says nothing about any mistake, says nothing about any second edition, and insists that this was a legitimate translation of the phrase. And then only when Mr. Simons comes to his defense do we get the other story that, okay, yeah, it was a mistake, but we're going to fix it in the next edition, but we just went with the error in the meantime so we can mislead thousands of people. And this is the sole officially approved Fatima apostolate. Make of that what you will. I have this to talk about. The link to Africa. Very interesting. This will take up the rest of the talk. But it ends, believe it or not, on a note of hope. And I think we have to, because I think what Miriam said has to be kept in mind. Because the Holy Ghost, after all, is involved in this whole historical scenario that we're living through. The link to Africa. Now, right now, the corrupt hierarchies of the Western nations are getting ready to send their representatives to Rome to plot for the institutionalization of mortal sin in the church. That's what they're doing. Let's face it, that's what this is all about. How many of you, when you heard the words Synod on the family being announced, began to worry about the family? I was one of them. They've ruined everything else. Now it's the family's turn. So they're going there to plot and scheme, and now we're finding out there isn't going to be any votes at the next session of the Synod, and there won't be any midterm report or any final document, just a lot of private discussion groups among various cabals who are there to see how they can subvert the moral edifice of the church. And apparently, the powers that be know that voting won't work this time. There's too much of an opposition. They can't win any votes at the Synod. It would be an embarrassment for he who controls the Synod, whose name I will not mention. But we see something very interesting developing in Africa, and I'm going to link this up to the message of Fatima. In June of 2015, 5 African cardinals and 45 African bishops met in Ghana to prepare for the Synod, and they produced a book of their various interventions and speeches entitled Christ's New Homeland. Christ's New Homeland, Africa. Contribution to the Synod on the Family by African Pastors. Very telling title. Apparently, the West is no longer Christ's homeland, because the West, as John Paul II admitted, is now in a state of silent apostasy, which of course is the complete abandonment of the Christian faith, as the Code of Canon Law says. So this book includes Cardinal Sarah's opening remarks to the gathering that produced the speeches that went into the book. I encourage you to speak with clarity and with one credible voice and with filial love for the church. Be conscious of the mission of the church. Protect the sacredness of marriage, which is now being attacked by all forms of ideologies that intend to destroy the family in Africa. Do not be afraid to stress the teaching of the church on marriage. Then the next month, on August 25th, the bishops of Ghana issued a joint statement declaring unequivocally the same revealed truth that the so-called Synod on the Family is determined to undermine. Quote, sacramental marriage is instituted by God as a permanent and indissoluble union between one man and one woman, open to life and love. Thus, other forms of unions, such as homosexual unions and adulterous unions, are inimical to the mind of the Creator. They undermine the integrity of the human being and the family, and as such should never be promoted or supported in our society. And they also vow to, quote, speak against and help fight the radical promotion of abortion, the use of condoms and other forms of contraception by various international groups and organizations through international platforms and humanitarian aid, end quote. You know, we just had a 187-page encyclical on a so-called ecological crisis. What is the greatest ecological crime in the world today, aside from abortion? Contraception. Is there any greater rebellion than contraception against God's divinely established ecological order? The attempt to interfere in the fertilization of an ovum? That is a monstrous tampering with nature. And where do we find contraception treated in Laudato Si? Why, nowhere. Not a single reference to this ecological crime on a planetary scale. No reference at all from the Vatican about contraception throughout the current pontificate. Now, in July, the bishops of Nigeria addressed these developments in a very telling way. The recent rise, they said, in lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender activism, the popular vote in the Republic of Ireland, concerning which the Vatican said nothing, and the Supreme Court decision in the United States of America, concerning which the Vatican said nothing, will tend to provoke a notable and rapid shift in public opinion about the nature and meaning of marriage and the family as it has been known for millennia, a development concerning which the Vatican said nothing. This, they continued, in many countries has inevitably led to powerful legislative and judicial maneuvers to redefine marriage to include same-sex marriage. We wish to state that this is a sad, unjust, and lamentable situation based largely upon a distorted perception of natural law, the will of God, and human nature. As the Catholic Bishops' Conference in Nigeria, they go on to say, we are concerned with the influence which some of these trends could have on morality and values. Now listen to this. We therefore hereby express our concern with regard to the persistent and continuous propagation and globalization of the homosexual lifestyle and the effort to redefine marriage, which is a distorted view of human sexuality, coming especially from the Western world. We call on our leaders to be circumspect, accepting this Western trend by officially endorsing homosexual unions and same-sex marriage will be devastating and detrimental to our nation, Nigeria, as it will lead to the inevitable deconstruction of the family and society at large with other serious but negative implications. And then, finally, on this point, before I get to its link with Fatima, in Christian Family, the French pro-Catholic journal, Cardinal Sarah expressed the entire African hierarchy's defiant no to the decadent Western views that this synod is being used to promote. He said, and I quote, "At the synod next October, we will address, I hope, the question of marriage in an entirely positive manner. The African bishops will act to support that which God asks of man concerning the family and to receive that which the church has always taught. We should think that only the Western vision of man, why should we think that only the Western vision of man, of the world, of society is good, just, and universal? The church must fight to say no to this new colonization." He's speaking of the colonization of the entire world by a decadent Western morality that is obviously being promoted in every way possible at this synod. Now, it's very ironic that when Francis went to Bolivia, he delivered what they're now calling the Bolivian Manifesto. And in that Bolivian Manifesto, he denounced new forms of colonialism, which seriously prejudiced the possibility of peace and justice. But he was talking about economics and social justice, not the decadent Western morality which is being used to colonize the entire world, including Africa. The African bishops recognize this. Pope apparently does not see a problem with the German bishops attempting to control the synod, or with any of the people he's placed in control of the synod, the vast majority of whom are engaged in this very process of colonizing the world with a morality that accommodates apostasy. Now, the link to Fatima. Seeing these developments, you wonder about another connection with the Fatima message. I've often quoted a conversation that the future Pope Pius XII had when he was Cardinal Pacelli in 1931 with Count Galeazzi, a Vatican architect, a man of great prestige, well-respected figure in the church, reported in the biography by Monsignor Roche. And by the way, I've been quoting this in a number of places. Somewhere I read that someone has attacked the veracity of this quotation and this entire conversation, the account of this conversation. And the person who attacked it, who's a priest by the name of Émile Poulat, was one of the very innovators that Pius XII foresaw in 1931 who would attempt to dismantle the church, as he said during this conversation. I won't quote that part again because it's not relevant. Émile Poulat was one of these innovators. Émile Poulat, who didn't like this book, renounced his priesthood and married someone after none other than Pius XII denounced the worker priest movement of which he was a member. So he laicized himself and married, and he died only last year. That's the critic of this book. That will tell you how worthwhile this book really is. And in this conversation, Cardinal Pacelli spoke of his great hopes for Catholicism in the undeveloped nations. At the same time, he was saying there's going to be an attack on the church in which we will see the suicide that would be represented by the alteration of the church in her liturgy, her theology, and her soul. At the same time he saw that coming in only a few years, and it would come, he had hope for Catholicism in the undeveloped nations. And during this conversation, one of the Vatican curial cardinals was skeptical, said something to the effect of, well, you're really overly optimistic about Africa. And he said in response, in the church of tomorrow, the peoples of color will participate in the government of the church. The undeveloped nations will save the church. A day will come when the civilized world will deny its God, when the church will doubt as Peter doubted. She will be tempted to believe that man has become God. He foresaw a day when the church would doubt as Peter doubted, and now, whatever his internal disposition is, we have a pope on an airplane having to answer the charge that he's an anti-pope. And his flippant answer is, I'll recite the creed if you like. Well, pray for the pope, by all means, but we have a serious papal situation on our hands, the likes of which the church has never seen, I would say. So have we not arrived at this day of ecclesial self-doubt, the day when the church will doubt as Peter doubted, in the human element, of course, not in the supernatural sense? And do we not witness precisely the prelates of Africa leading the forces battling at the Synod to save the church from the consequences of that doubt? Of course, in the end, it's not men or bishops or even cardinals who will save the church, but God acting through human instruments, each of us and the members of the hierarchy. It is God who infallibly and in all ages secures the promise of indefectibility that Christ gave the church at its foundation. So to conclude on a note of hope, and I'm taking my cue here from what Miriam said, in the designs of providence, which we cannot read, we can only try to read some signs of the times, but no one knows what's in the mind of God for certain until he reveals his will. In those inscrutable designs, even Francis himself, in spite of himself, could become an instrument for the restoration of the church. Let's keep in mind that he began his pontificate at the time that I was gushing over him, as I hasten to point out again, by having it consecrated to none other than Our Lady of Fatima, revealing yet again the enduring connection of the Fatima apparitions to the course of church history in our time. Thank you.